Good evening to our Gaborone Book Fest guests, and welcome to this evening's session of Gaborone Book Fest. Our guest today is Nanjala, and she is the author of Traveling While Black. Nanjala?
Hello, how are you?
I'm well, and how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Yes. Welcome to Gaborone Book Fest 2021.
Happy to be here, always a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you back here again. The last time you were here, it was what, 2019?
2019, yes, in Gaborone.
Yes, in Gaborone. So welcome, although it's virtual. Hopefully next time this year around, we will have you here physically in Gaborone. So today
Absolutely.
we are discussing your book, Traveling While Black. And I know that a lot of our fans have not had the opportunity to read it. So what I'd like for you to do is just to give us a brief thought process of what inspired this collection of essays.
Sure. So Traveling While Black represents about 15 years of life experiences. And it's a collection of essays that are reflecting on human mobility from different perspectives. Some of them are personal essays, so my own experiences of travel and displacement and migration and all of that. Some of them are more conceptual, looking at it from a high level, thinking about some of what's changing in the world today in terms of access to mobility, to migration, and especially how race and racism can become so easily integrated into the way we do policy work if we're not careful or conscious about what it is that we're doing. So some of the essays are thinking about that, because I used to, obviously, professionally, this was something that I did for a couple of years. And some of the essays are about home and place, because I think a lot of the times when we think about travel, we always think about leaving. We always think about departing, and we don't spend enough time thinking about what it is that makes people leave. What is it that makes people depart? And so there's a couple of essays that are reflecting on my own hometown, Nairobi, how it's changing, how it stays the same, and what it means to not be at home in your own home, and what it means to be forcefully separated from the place that other people especially expect you to be most at peace. So it's really a diverse collection of essays. And as I say in the introduction, it's conceived of as kind of like a farewell to the space, because it's something that I did professionally for a number of years. It's something that I'm probably not going to do professionally moving forward. But I wanted to end that chapter of my life with a little bit of reflection and inviting other people to reflect on some of the things that I'd seen and experienced.
Yes. I do. I know it comes quite often throughout your book that this is not a traveling memoir. It is mostly about probably an influence of academia, a bit of academia in it, in terms of visa application, immigration laws, and migration, and what makes people migrate from one place to another. So in your opinion, is there a vast difference between challenges that you face as a Black person traveling in the world? First of all, traveling for pleasure. Secondly, migrating. And thirdly, and I need clarity on this, if there's a difference between migrating and immigrating.
Yeah, I mean, to the first part, there's definitely a difference when you're traveling as a Black person, and as a Black woman especially, in the world. And this is another reason why it was important for me to have personal essays, because some of the things are so perceptible to you when you're in the body that's being unfairly criminalized, unfairly punished, that you can't easily express in words, and that people who don't know that feeling or who don't inhabit that body don't necessarily see as a pattern. They kind of see it as a one-off thing. Before I came to the States, I remember the day I've been on the same flight 3 times in the last um, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and I've been quote unquote randomly searched every single time. And I was telling the person who was doing the searching, I said, I already know that you're going to stop me for my quote unquote random search, so let's just get over the formality. And when you say that to people who, you know, are not Black, people who are not in or you know, brown, as it were, I think they think that you're being hyperbolic and that you're exaggerating. But again, when you're in the body and you see the patterns, you you know what it is to go through borders, and to especially airports, especially Western airports. You know what it is to land in Brussels and the Africa terminal is, you know, terrible, and the flights that are going and elsewhere are, you know, fantastic. You know what it is to arrive in Charles de Gaulle in Paris and be quote unquote randomly pulled out. So all the Black people get randomly pulled out for enhanced screening. Like, these are some of the things that happen. And if you're not careful, it becomes such a normalized part of travel policy that the people who are the Black people, if we don't find space to speak up about it and to raise our voices about it, it just becomes normalized. But, you know, of course, tied to that is the fact that all of these visa applications are so contingent on intangible things that I think a lot of people are scared, unwilling, unable to speak up because they think, well, how will this affect my future visa applications? And I have to tell you, it's something that definitely occurred to me when I was writing the book. I was like, you know, this is actually fairly risky, you know, calling this stuff out, being the troublemaker. It's fairly risky proposition. But at the same time, I thought to myself, you already have so much, you've had so much more than most other people. There is no reason not to use that privilege to speak up against an injustice that's taking shape. So that's the first part of your question. The second part of your question, is there a difference between migrating and emigrating? I think there is. When you're traveling for school and you're traveling for leisure even, or you're traveling for work and things like that, you can always go back. And I think that makes you more tolerant of some of the abuses, because you kind of think to yourself, well, I can always go back. I can always turn around. I think people who migrate permanently, there's a loss that happens there that is really deep. So even if you're just migrating by choice, you know, I have a lot of people, unfortunately, in Kenya, we've had in the last couple of years, a lot of people emigrating permanently. And they do it because the country is becoming very difficult. It's becoming very difficult to make a living and things like that. And, you know, I see them, you know, going online and talking about how hard it is to find their favorite food, how hard it is to find community, how hard it is to find people who, you know, will laugh at the same things that you do. And these are not easy things to quantify. These are not easy things to say, you know, it cost 50 Rand for me to lose visiting my grandmother every month, right? But that is a loss. That is a psychological loss. And I think that's what makes it different. When you leave permanently versus when you leave knowing you can always go back, there's a little bit slightly less psychological loss. There's not that severance of connection, and home, you know, losing home. Nobody wants to lose home lightly. It's not a decision that people take lightly, but losing home has that extra psychological burden that I think traveling for leisure doesn't necessarily have. And that's one of the things I was trying to communicate, or not for leisure, but traveling migrating in a less permanent way kind of has a different experience.
Okay. When you're talking about the disconnection, you remind me of what you spoke about when you were reflecting on Bessie Head's books. When you talk about, if I could just pull out the page, I think you were talking about alienation and disorientation that arises through migration and immigration. And it struck me that in our world, we use phrases such as creating a more inclusive society. and try going out of our ways to create a more inclusive society, to become more welcoming to refugee seekers and migrants and immigrants within our own borders. How far do you think it is that we are able to attain this? And how is it that we can make our own little communities more welcoming of travelers, regardless of the reasons why they're traveling?
I think on the whole, the world is becoming more hostile to travel, generally, migration generally. I think refugees are feeling the worst of it, because obviously to become a refugee, that severance, that separation comes on the other end of force. There's force that's attached to that. A refugee is often a person who doesn't even have time to gather, personal photographs, letters, things that have sentimental values. A person who really just has to walk out of their home and not know what they're walking towards. So there is definitely growing hostility towards people who are on the move. And I think there's a lot of people taking this for granted, policymakers especially. And it's one of the reasons why I wrote this book in the voice that I wrote, which is kind of moving between academia and reflection and all of that, because I think a lot of the academics and the policymakers, they live in the technical terms, and they don't see that some of the things that they're talking about are happening to human beings and are happening to people who have histories and lives and loves that they're leaving behind. So there was an intentional decision there to move between these voices, because I really want ordinary people to feel, non-specialists, non-academic, non-policymaker specialists, to feel like they have something to contribute to this conversation, to just have like an entry point for understanding this conversation. But I also want policymakers to feel like they can speak about these issues in a very humane and in a very approachable way and in a human way, so that we remember that this is happening to people. And I think, one of the things that can really make a difference is people in the community speaking up for refugees. And this has happened in a number of communities. Like, in fact, just yesterday, one of the state representatives in Montana, in the United States, he went on Twitter and he said, I'm disappointed that the US government is sending 75 Afghan refugees to Montana. And this is a really strange thing, because Montana has a population of 1 million. It's about the same size as Germany as a state, but Germany has a population of 83 million. And Germany has received over 1 million refugees in the last year or so. So 75 refugees in a massive state it won't even change the demographics. At a macro level, it won't even change the demographics. But there's a level of hostility there that is not about the numbers, and it's not about the statistics. It's about racism. It's about not wanting people who are different. And what really encouraged me when I saw the responses to that tweet was the sheer number of people saying, "You do not speak for us. You are not of us. You are not representative of the kind of state that we want to be." And that's the kind of energy that I think we need to keep seeing. We need to keep seeing people speaking up for refugees. Ultimately, refugees and migrants are people of all stripes, because first of all, as I say in the book, human mobility has been with us. Migration makes our societies richer. Migration makes our communities richer. When Indian food comes, it makes our food more interesting. When people go up and introduce music, different styles of music, different styles of writing, different styles of culture, that's also part of the human experience. And it's not an economic thing, but it also makes our societies richer. So speaking up for people is something that might seem small, but is really important, because our public lives, it's a conversation between us as a community and the people who govern us. And if we are silent, then only one voice dominates the conversation, and that's the voice that is against, because that the people who are against will never stop talking, will never stop shouting, will never stop trying to get that message across. So I really would encourage people who want to see more inclusive societies to keep speaking up for refugees and keep speaking up for migrants and keep speaking up for travelers.
Okay. You raised an important point of all of this being shrouded or emanating from fear, right? Fear of that which is different from us. And in your book, you speak about how immigration laws are ways of formalizing that fear into laws and into policies to continuously keep that which is different from us from entering into our borders. And you give examples of the most stringent visa processes, starting from the administrative aspect of it and to the high fees that are associated with the visa processing application. So what I would like is an insight from you as to, first of all, is that process really necessary? I think that's the starting point. Is there a way of us doing it? Because from the way, if you go into the Botswana website and you look at all the countries which we require visas, or people from which countries require visa to enter Botswana, there is a certain of negative stories about these countries in the media, right? So the issue is then, is that what influences governments to say countries X, Y, Z, we would require a more thorough process before you enter? And does that also influence the then citizens of the host countries into sort of having this fear of these people and not accepting these people once they enter their borders?
I'll tell you something. If there's anything that the COVID pandemic and the travel restrictions around COVID pandemics should have taught people at this stage, is that countries put visa restrictions and travel restrictions on countries that they can get away with putting restrictions on, right? So even when Europe was at the epicenter of the pandemic, most poor countries did not put travel restrictions on Europeans until it was completely out, until we were unable to control our own outbreaks, right? The British government put pressure on Commonwealth countries to keep their borders open for British tourists, right? Meanwhile, when we had the Ebola outbreak in 2014, the speed at which people closed their borders to Liberia, Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau, DRC, it was breakneck speed. Because they can, because those are poor countries that don't have the geopolitical clout to say you can't do this. And in fact, it wasn't just those countries. Many countries closed the borders to even more African countries. And so we have, if there's anything that you should see about the patterns that have happened with travel restrictions, it's countries close their borders to other countries because they can. The UK will close their borders to Kenya, but Kenya cannot close the borders to the UK. It's not a one-to-one sort of reciprocal thing, unless a country decides that it's gonna, like Brazil has a 100% reciprocal policy. You close the border on Brazilians, they will close the border on you. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is, you would be surprised also at how quickly, if we don't speak up, how these things get normalized. So when I tell people before 2011, the September 11th attack, I think it was 2001, sorry, there was no Department of Homeland Security. It didn't exist. It was something that was created after the September 11th attacks. So if you had a student visa, a US student visa, you could that's all you needed. Same as any other country. If you have a student visa, it's fine. But now, because there's DHS, there's something called the SEVIS fee that all students have to, if you need a visa, you have to apply for. It's an extra administrative fee, $220 on top of the $160 that you paid for your visa. That fee doesn't change your visa. It's administered separately from your visa. You're basically paying the Department of Homeland Security to surveil you, to keep an eye on you. You're paying for your own surveillance, right? And because nobody pushed back, a lot of people did push back on the creation of the DHS. A lot of people pushed back on the creation of ICE. A lot of people said, we don't need these institutions. We just need to do better at the visa, because you already submit all of these things, you get scrutinized at the visa level, but it became accepted. And now very few people question why it is that international students going to the US have to pay this extra $220 on top of the money that they've paid for their visa, right? That's how easily things get normalized and get integrated into our lives, our political, public lives, our administration of travel. In less than 10 years, this has become a normal and accepted extra bureaucratic process for visa. The same thing is happening right now with the UK. The UK is also building this parallel surveillance architecture, and it's been building it for a number of years. South Africa, eventually, when all of these countries are done doing this, African countries will start to do the same, because that's how paranoia works. It travels to different parts of the world, and it starts off with the countries that will do the least to speak up for their own citizens. So the first people who will feel the impact of these new surveillance architectures of migration, of travel, will be Africans. And after Africans, it will be Asians. And after Asians, it will be Latin Americans, because our countries will not speak up for us. And so this is why when I speak about, you know, COVID travel restrictions, it's not that I don't think that we need some kind of architecture, some kind of mechanism to think about how do we prevent people from spreading disease, right? It's not that I'm saying we don't have to have vaccination cards. I'm saying it's a lot easier to build an extra bureaucratic process that is targeting specific people based on underlying racialized fears of contagion, of you know, being unworthy. It's a lot easier to build those systems than it is to unbuild those systems. And this is what the head of the Africa CDC said that I think is so important. He said they will vaccinate everybody and put in place travel restrictions, and then Africa will become the continent of COVID. That's the path that we're on now, and that's why we have to resist these things, because in the past, this is how they become normalized and accepted. So it's all of which is to say that the book is really trying to draw attention to the fact that policy doesn't happen in a social vacuum. These ideas of criminalizing movement, of restricting movement of the other, it doesn't happen in a social vacuum. It's a response to something. The decision to allow Black people to die on the Mediterranean Sea is a reflection of the resurgent right in Europe. It's the fact that right-wing politics has become normalized in Europe, has found a place in parliament, found a place in cities, found, you know, there's the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Italy for a number of years was a member of the far right, the 5 Points movement. So that's what I really want people to think about. And especially now that we see some of these policies becoming normalized, even in Africa, that we are now criminalizing each other. But everybody wants to show that they are, you know, Europe light and America light.
Yes.
So Kenya is criminalizing Somali people, and South Africa is criminalizing Zimbabwean people, and Cote d'Ivoire is criminalizing, you know, Ghana is criminalizing Nigerian people. Like, it's against the spirit of Ubuntu, but it's also just a reflection of how policy can be so insidious if we don't stop and think about what it is that we're building.
Thank you for bringing that one up, because that was the next topic for discussion. How you highlighted how the manner in which that Africans also treat other Africans who are seeking either to travel for leisure or to just migrate for better opportunities, whether it's education or economic, right? At the back of it, what fuels this?
I think it's wanting to, at least I'll say this, in the examples of Kenya, South Africa, there's a scarcity mindset that is very prevalent in almost every country in the world, that people feel like policymakers are acting like there's not enough success, there's not enough for everybody, and so it has to be the survival of one over the survival of all of us. And we also saw this again with the COVID and with vaccines, right? The United States has 1.5 billion doses of vaccine on order and in storage between January 2021 and December 2023. That's the reason why we can't buy vaccines in Africa, not because we don't have money, right? A lot of countries put the money together. It's because it's the scarcity mindset that we have to hoard this stuff because we have to survive. And the individual, the survival of the national is more important than the survival of the international. So that's the scarcity mindset. And the other thing is wanting to show yourself strong. Nations wanting to show themselves strong, because the border for a lot of countries is the only place where the central state can make its presence felt. The Kenyan government doesn't have control over 100% of the territory. No government does. There is no government in the world that knows 100% of what 100% of its citizens are doing 100% of the time. That's why we have, and all of this surveillance things that governments are trying to do is an attempt to get to that. And I don't think that that's a worthy endeavor. I think what you want to do instead is you want to build a society in which people want the society to succeed. People are invested in, each other and building good communities, but surveillance is trying to find a shortcut to building those kinds of just, inclusive societies. Anyway, is to say that then this mechanism happens at the border as well. So we have African countries that are struggling to control their economies, struggling to build healthcare systems, struggling to build education systems, struggling to build, opportunities for people, struggling on what is left that can be an easy win that has both social signification, right? And also it doesn't require the same investment as, say, making sure that everybody has access to quality healthcare. That's what borders represent. It's an opportunity for countries that are otherwise incapable of managing their domestic affairs to say we are actually strong. We're a strong government. It's a soft target. And I say this because look at Rwanda has gone in the opposite direction. Rwanda has made itself 100% visa free for all Africans. There's no invasion of in Rwanda. Nobody has taken opportunities away from Rwandan people. Like it's if anything, more people are traveling to Rwanda for leisure. More people are going right now. It's the anniversary of the genocide. They're are there for those events. More people are going to the gorilla naming events. More it's actually been better for the Rwandan people. So I think this is the underlying anxiety. It's governments wanting to show themselves strong and looking for a soft target, and instead of building the kind of societies where people will be invested in, my education is provided for well, and my healthcare is provided for well, and all of this is provided for well, then I'm invested in, making sure that my neighborhood is safe, and making sure that my community is and there's enough to go around, there's enough to share. I think those are the things that I think that are influencing this anxiety towards harsher border controls, harsher punishments, and rejection of refugees and migrants.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that, because when you look at, for lack of a better word, I would say developed countries or more progressive countries, most of them have their economies have been built on the backbone of migrants and immigrants. I mean, you take, for example, the US, that it has a great population of Italians, Irish people, you name it, and these are the people who have contributed to what we now see as a progressive society. So it still bothers me as to why we would so much fear migrants coming over, as if I think they would either take over our country.
In fact, when I think about it, I always think, well, you talk about Italians, Irish people, but you also need to think about slaves. Slaves built the United States. Now, granted, slaves are not migrants in the traditional sense of the word, but they're people who were brought over against their will and provided the free labor and the free, consequence-free, violent labor that made America possible, right? When you think about colonization, the emigration of Europeans, and this is not ancient history, right? The former advisor to the Boris Johnson's government, Dominic Cummings, his wife is the granddaughter of the last governor of Kenya. So we're not talking about ancient history. We're talking about the fact that Western people, white people, being able to circulate freely in the world and impose themselves on the rest of the world in all the way until the first half of the 20th century is the main reason why the West is popular. We're talking about the spice trade. We're talking about India. We're talking about the free labor that happened in our colonies, the extraction. So less than a generation later, we're saying, no, you can't come. Our grandfathers could come there and behave terribly and do all these terrible things, but you can't come. There's something there about paranoia and fear, and I don't know what the reconciliation of that is, but I think for me that's another reason why I wanted to write this book, because the R word, people tiptoe around it in migration policy, and people sort of and hum. And I wanted to say it's racist. It's racist. It's not about, the policy. It's really about keeping people who look different out. Because when you look at the fact that a person from Finland who can go to the United States and work without scrutiny, but there are currently so many Haitians who are dying under a bridge in Mexico because the US won't let them in. It's not about legality and rules and laws and things like that. It's about race. And that's the thing that I wanted to call out. And I hope that people feel like they can actually call this stuff out more vocally.
I think you've really done a great job in terms of zeroing in and naming it for what it really is, which is just racism. I think whether consciously or unconsciously, we've gone out of our way to sort of develop policies and checks and balances, which would then nitpick on people of color as opposed to any other race in the world. And we are then bearing the brunt of these policies in our desire to either move for leisure, for opportunities for education, for better hospital, medical services, et cetera.
Yeah, I think for me, what I really try to tell African policymakers is we have to develop a different way of thinking about mobility and migration. We have the history. Earlier this year, when the conflict in Ethiopia broke out, or late last year, when the conflict in Ethiopia broke out, so many thousands of Ethiopians crossed the border into Sudan. And the people in Sudan, the poor people in Sudan, this was a very small town, they kept their doors open. They gave those guys access to land. They gave them materials to build their homes. They helped them settle into the thing because they said, hey, you know what? These people, they might be across an international border, but they are part of our community. We cannot let them starve. That is the spirit of Ubuntu. That is part of our traditions. So many African communities have a tradition of hospitality and have a tradition of welcoming outsiders, whether they're fleeing war, whether they're fleeing conflict. Uganda has hosted millions of refugees over the number of years. Angolan refugees have made a home for themselves in Zambia. We have that history. We should not allow ourselves to be distracted from it. We should not allow that to be eroded from us. I give the example when I was backpacking a number of years ago. I was backpacking from Cape Town to Cairo. So I was using the buses to get back to Cape Town to Nairobi, sorry. And I got to Malawi and I was walking through the streets of Lilongwe and I kept seeing these, they have the big pots, we call them nyungus in Kiswahili, with water and a cup just outside the house so that people who are walking home after work when it's hot could have drinking water. It's a small thing, but it happens in so many communities. It happens in Sudan. It happens all across the Sahel. And the recognition that you cannot deny someone water because water is life. You cannot deny someone who's about to pass out water. That is our tradition of welcome, our tradition of hospitality. And yet look at what water represents now for young African men, women who are trying to get to Europe. It's death. The biggest graveyard for African people right now is the Mediterranean Sea. Right. And these are the kind of things that I really hope when I wrote this book, on the other side of it, the person I was imagining reading it was first and foremost African people, and especially African women, because I just really want us to hold on to our traditions of Ubuntu and our traditions of welcome and not follow this European Western paradigm of exclusion and racist exclusion, because I think it's not sustainable, but it's violent and people are dying and it's not good. let's not follow that because we're trying to be Europe light or America light. Let's hold fast to the traditions and to the practices that allowed our ancestors to survive even when things were very, very dire and things were very, very difficult. Let's keep being that nyungu that's providing water to travelers and providing rest to migrants.
Hallelujah to that. Let's spread that. But then coming back and trying to like soften it down a bit. From your travel experience, especially within Africa, which countries would you say were the most easiest for you to enter or to get your visa?
On the spot.
You're putting me on the spot. If you feel uncomfortable about it, there's absolutely, we can skip it over and move right along.
I'll tell you this. Well, I love traveling in Africa because a Kenyan passport can actually take you very far in Africa. So south of the equator, I think I've been to almost every single African country south of the equator, except Angola, because the Angolan visa is quite difficult for Kenyans. And the Comoros, because I just haven't had time to go. And Burundi, again, that's a time thing. And like I told you, when I took the bus, the hardest part of taking the buses from Cape Town to Nairobi, that's almost 5,500 kilometers, was getting into South Africa. But once I got into South Africa, once the South African visa was sorted, the rest, everything else was easy. People were so nice and so welcoming. And it really was just a question of showing up at the border and getting my passport stamped and asking, where are you going, where are you staying, and moving on. So I love moving. I love going to Senegal. I love going, the DRC, same thing. It looks really difficult from the outside, but I've been to Goma multiple times. I love that because it's such an atypical experience when you have an African passport and you try to go to Asia. I think Nepal and Singapore, Malaysia are exceptions, but it's difficult. Some Latin American countries, you need 6 weeks because they have to send your passport to the capital and then send it back to you. I've never been to South America because I look at the visa procedure and I think to myself, oh my gosh, who has time for that? And so I think that there is something really special about the way in which some of our countries have held on to that spirit of openness and that spirit of welcome. I would 100% encourage African women, especially, to travel throughout, to travel in the continent when they can. When I was backpacking, it wasn't an expensive, fancy holiday. I was taking buses, and when like local buses, like we call them matatus, taxis.
Yes.
And
yes.
When I started the trip, because I think some of us who are travelers, we think I must buy a plane ticket and I must book this 3-star hotel and I must. And I didn't do any of that. It was the first time in my life that second time that I hadn't really done any of that. It was just, I kept saying to myself, if this market woman who is coming from Johannesburg to Gaborone can take this bus, then I can also take this bus. If this person who is taking their chickens to Bulawayo can take this bus, then I can also take that bus. And because of that attitude, being able to cross 6 countries in 3 weeks and have that really local experience that honestly is not available to everyone, but it's available to you as an African traveler. Do it while you're relatively young and your back can take it, because sitting on a bus for 12 hours is not easy. And see these countries beyond the headlines. Have the conversations with people on the bus, have the conversations with people in the market stalls. Do it while you're still young, because I'm telling you, there's so much joy and beauty and wonder on this continent that gets lost in the headlines and gets lost in the paranoias of other people.
Mm-hmm. Especially mainstream media. Exactly.
Especially.
But for
Especially.
yes. But for a lot of women, I know safety is one of their major concerns. So in about 30 seconds, what safety tips can you give to women traveling, whether alone or as a group of women throughout Africa? What should they prepare themselves for?
That's a fantastic question. One is always stay in a place that has a door that locks. You have to be able to lock the door. So when you check in, the first thing to do is check that you can lock the door and check that you can lock the windows. The second thing is try and make sure that there's someone who knows where you are. When you arrive in a town, text someone, message someone and say, this is where I am, this is where I'm staying, I've checked in, this is the phone number, just in case you might never need to use it, but just make sure people know where you are, especially if you're traveling alone. Don't accept drinks from strangers, especially drinks that you haven't seen them being opened. Try and keep a reusable water bottle with you, so you always have water with you and you're not dependent on drinks that you haven't seen how they're opened and things like that. If you are most people, 90% of people in the world are good people. You're just worried about the remaining 10%. So it's a question of finding ways of building trust very quickly over a short period of time. Don't get into cars that, especially if you're taking taxis at night, try and get like a taxi that is registered with the official agency. And again, make sure people know where you are, where you're going and things like that. Be with other people. Try and be with other people. So like I said, local buses, be with other people. Older women are usually a godsend. Those market women that you see are usually a godsend. Like you're not necessarily going to be best friends, but help them put their things on the bus so that they'll be conscious that you're on this bus, and they'll be kind of looking out for you in like a motherly way. But go and experience. I'm telling you, traveling in Africa, especially backpacking solo in Africa, has created so much space for my academic work, for my intellectual work, for my writing work. It's opened up so much space for me, and it's a life-changing thing. And I really especially encourage African women, try it. Just try it. I think you'll enjoy it.
I think we'll take up on that challenge. Now, Nanjala, this is a book fest. And as we conclude, COVID has allowed us time to sort of slow down, but it's also caused a bit of anxiety in us. Are there any books that you would recommend, books that you've read in this past year that have uplifted your spirits, helped you, given you tips, grown you somewhere or the other, or books that you just found very humorous and something that the rest of us would like to read?
Okay. I've been reading a lot of Octavia Butler. It's not humorous. It's the opposite, but it's like she's foreseeing a lot of the challenges that we're facing, and she writes beautifully. Wild Seed is a fantastic imagination of an African. It's almost like a folktale, but it's reimagined. So I've been reading a lot of Octavia Butler. I really enjoyed Yewande Omotoso's The Woman Next Door. I thought that was really beautifully written story about two people figuring out what it means to be fair to each other. I've been reading a lot of books in translation. So Mariam Aloui is a Moroccan writer. She has a book called Straight from the Horse's Mouth. It's so funny. And it's just an amazing read. I mean, those are the books that are kind of standing out in my mind right now, because I really did enjoy them. I've been reading a lot, like I said, a lot of books in translation, and I found that there's a whole other world of writing, of African writing, that I would encourage people to engage with. The Mad Woman of Serrano by Dina Salostillo, that's a Portuguese translation, so good. Yeah, those are books that I think people would enjoy in these very strange times.
Okay. All right. No, thank you for those tips. Is there any, do you have your book with you?
I do not. I'm not at home.
No worries. Don't worry about that. Oh, well. Nanjala, it's been a fabulous 45 minutes. It's amazing how time just flies by when you're having fun.
I know.
Yes.
I know.
Any last parting words that you'd like to say to our followers?
Everybody should read Bessie Head. I think that's my theme for 2021. That's a great place to start in terms of reading books that are great. Read Maru, read When Rain Clouds Gather, read all of it. So that's my parting thought. Everybody should read Bessie Head.
Thank you so much, Nanjala, and thank you so much for joining us. Hope to see you in 2022. Stay safe.
Hopefully. Thank you, you too.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.
Bye. Well, that is the end of our session with Nanjala, and I would encourage all of you to grab yourself a copy of this book. It's called Traveling While Black, and check with your local bookstore to see if it's available, and if not, just ask them to order one for you. Thank you for joining us, and this will be our last session for this evening. We'll catch everybody tomorrow. Bye.